Hi, it's Sylvester, and I wanted to talk about the novel The Bell Jar because I read it again for the first time since high school. This was my favorite novel for a long time. I read it only once and then never read it again, which is weird because when I find novels that I like, I will usually read them more than once. And if I really like a novel, I used to buy the novels that I really liked. Like, I had a copy of Catcher in the Rye and Slaughterhouse-Five and some other books, and I reread those books often because I really liked them. But The Bell Jar was my favorite book, but I never reread it. I only ever read it once, and I think the reason for that is because it was so relatable that it hit a little bit too close to home, and reading it more than once would have been too much for me. As much as I liked it, I really related to it so much that it felt kind of depressing to revisit it. So it took me a long time to read it again, and as you might have gotten from the title, I have some thoughts about this novel. Now, if you don't know what The Bell Jar is, it is I have some notes written down, so if I'm not looking at the camera, I'm reading from my laptop. It is a semi-autobiographical novel, and the author, Sylvia Plath, committed suicide 1 month after it was published, although some people think she was murdered by her husband and it was made to look like a suicide, and the conspiracy theorist in me kind of believes that, but that is neither here nor there. So again, it's semi-autobiographical, and it is about a teenage girl, a 19-year-old girl, who suffers with mental illness. She is severely depressed, and she lives in the 1950s, and we, as a society, did not really know how to treat mentally ill people in the 1950s. We're still learning how to treat mentally ill people, but especially in the 1950s, things were very different, let's just say. So, even though I couldn't relate to the whole living in the 1950s thing, it still sometimes feels like the way we treat mental illness is very archaic, and so I related to how the main character felt, and I didn't necessarily relate to her experiences, because at one point she did end up in an asylum. Spoiler alert, by the way, this is going to be full of spoilers. So she does end up in an asylum at one point in the novel, so I didn't know what that was like, but that was definitely something that I had a big fear of. I've always been mentally ill. I didn't actually get diagnosed until 2018 or something, but I've always had mental illnesses, I'm pretty sure. They were just untreated and undiagnosed, and as a teenager, when I read this book, I was definitely scared of the idea of being locked away in an asylum because I was mentally ill, treated like I was some kind of criminal and poked and prodded by doctors, and, generally just not treated very well, all because I was mentally ill, which is something that I couldn't change about myself. It's something that I didn't choose to be mentally ill, it was just something that kind of happened to me, so I didn't feel like I should be punished for it, and being locked away in an asylum certainly feels like punishment for a lot of people, I would assume. I've been stuck in a psych ward before, but I've never been in an actual institution for the mentally unwell, so I don't really know what it's like, but I still do fear that. It is one of my greatest fears to just have all my rights and freedoms stripped from me, and to get thrown in an institution, and to not be allowed to leave, and just... It was, again, one of my biggest fears. I even wrote a play about that very thing happening, about a girl who was stuck in an institution because she was mentally ill. So, this book really, really resonated with me. But, upon reading it again, as somebody who is being treated for my mental illnesses, as somebody who has been diagnosed and who is on medication, I look back on who I was the first time I read this novel, and I see so much of that person in the main character of this novel, and it allows me to kind of see who I used to be in a clearer light, if that makes any sense. Because again, I related so hard to her that now, as an adult reading the novel, it is kind of like I'm peering into my own past. And one thing that really stuck out to me that didn't really click when I was a teenager reading this novel is that the main character is actually pretty unlikable, and, I'm not trying to be hard on her because, again, she is a teenager and she's severely depressed and she lives in the 50s, and if I was a depressed teenage girl living in the 50s, I would also probably be pretty unlikable because that's just a mixture of unpleasant circumstances, you know what I mean? But so I'm not trying to be too hard on her, but she certainly is very, very flawed. Now, I have a list here of ways that I find this character to be flawed. First of all, she's kind of racist and a little bit homophobic. I did not notice that the first time I read this novel, but the second time reading it, I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, this novel is definitely a product of its time. It was a different time. But yeah, she's a little bit racist and a little bit homophobic. She's very judgmental. She hates short men. She dislikes people for what they wear. She describes people very bluntly in her head, and she's very hung up on people's appearances, especially men's appearances. She's very picky about men and how handsome they must be in order to be in her presence, and she's just again, she's very, very judgmental. And I can understand that because she's cynical. And again, when I look back on who I was when I first read this novel, I was also very cynical and very judgmental, and I just kind of looked down on everyone and everything because I just felt like nothing was good and nothing was worthy. I was just so severely depressed that it was I didn't like anything, everything sucked kind of thing. And so, yeah, anyways, the next thing is she left her drunk friend on the floor in the hallway in a pile of her own vomit, which, pretty rude, if you ask me. In the movie theater, there's a part where she's in a movie theater. She goes out of her way to step on people's feet as she's exiting the theater just because she's in a bad mood, because she's not feeling well, which, again, very rude, but it does seem like something that a cynical, depressed teenager would do, so it is, again, feels quite grounded in reality, in my opinion. She can be quite mean at times. At one point, this girl tells her that she likes her, and she, the main character, says, I don't remember the exact quote, but I should have written it down, but it's something like, I dislike you and you make me want to puke. And then she leaves. And it's so rude. This person is her friend, kind of. I mean, the main character doesn't really like this person, but this person likes the main character, and this person's very nice to the main character. The main character has no reason to be mean to this person, but she just is, because she's just kind of mean sometimes. You know what I mean? She's kind of immature as well, and I mean, again, she is 19, so it does feel kind of realistic for her to be a little bit immature, but again, makes her somewhat unlikable. And I can understand why so many people don't like this novel, because when I read it, I loved it so much, and I related so hard to the main character that I got really personally offended when people would say that they didn't like this book because they didn't like the main character, because I saw myself in the main character. So if they didn't like her, that meant they didn't like me, right? But again, reading this as an adult whose mental illnesses have been treated, not cured, but treated, I can look back and realize that, yeah, she was a little bit unlikable, wasn't she? People with untreated mental illnesses can sometimes be unpleasant to be around. I mean, irritability is a common symptom of depression, and so, and just, again, not seeing worth in anything, and not liking anything because nothing brings you joy, being kind of cynical, being depressed can make you kind of unpleasant to be around, because it's unpleasant to be yourself. It's unpleasant to exist as a depressed person. So it's hard to be pleasant for other people's benefit, right? And it resonated with me when I was a teenager, and it feels like a very raw, accurate portrayal of mental illness. Like, I do see a lot of realism in this, and I can see how this was semi-autobiographical and based on a lot of Sylvia Plath's real experiences, because, yeah, it is written quite, you know, it does feel very realistic to me. Like, the main character is not changed in such a way that she's made to be more likable than, you know what I mean? Like, it's not, they don't sugarcoat the experience of being mentally ill. They don't try to doll it up and make it seem better than it actually is, right? Like, it's unpleasant to read at times, and the main character is kind of unpleasant, but again, that just, to me, feels like a very honest depiction of what it can be like to be severely depressed. Now, I don't think that I just read the novel, but I'm pretty sure that they don't actually give the main character a diagnosis. And I keep saying the main character because I didn't write down her name, and I know her name's Esther Greenwood, but I always second guess myself, and so I'm sitting here being like, I should have written down her name, because, like, I feel like I'm gonna upload this video and then realize it's not Esther Greenwood, but I'm pretty sure it's Esther Greenwood. I will leave a pinned comment down below if I happen to get that wrong, but I don't think Esther is actually given an official diagnosis in the novel. Again, I just read it, but my memory is really bad, but I don't, so maybe it's in there, but I don't think it is. But it seems like most people on the internet agree that she's dealing with pretty severe depression, and to me it does seem like depression. She might have other mental illnesses, but you know, again, they don't say it in the book. They don't give her other diagnoses or any diagnoses in the book that I'm aware of. So yeah, I just want to give you, if you want to read this novel, which I do think you should, because it is good. It can be a little hard to read at times, but I do think it is a good book, and it is a classic, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading it very much, so I think you should read this book, but I'm going to give you some content warnings if you want to read this book. There's, again, as I mentioned, some racism, there's some homophobia, there's obviously depictions of mental illness, there's attempted rape, there's injury related to sex, and outdated, inhumane medical treatments for mental illness. So if any of those things upset you, tread lightly. And my overall thoughts for this novel is that I think it's well written. It still speaks to me and has a lot of good things to say about being a mentally ill teenage girl in the 1950s, even though I've never been a teenage girl in the 1950s. Like, I do feel like it is a pretty realistic depiction of that, and I still really like it. So those are my thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Stay frosty. Bye.